So today we are working on the Impreza and we have removed the engine. We're doing the clutch on this, and it is, when you're working on the ground like I am, it is quicker, easier and safer to just pull the engine out. It took about an hour and 15 minutes. So I like to lay the air conditioning pump off to one side. The power steering pump also needs to go off to one side so the engine can clear it. The slave cylinder I bungee out of the way. And I basically just let the starter motor fall wherever it wants. As long as it's behind the gearbox, to be honest, it doesn't really matter. So the gearbox is held on by 4 bolts. And then there are 2 starter motor bolts as well. One of them, the top one, has a bracket that goes on it as well, so make sure you remember the orientation of that. And if you're likely to forget, take a photo. So the engine mounts go through the 2 slots that you can see there. There is a threaded stud that goes through each one with a nut on the other side. And then the 2 exhaust manifolds are held on with 3 nuts on a stud. Sometimes the stud comes with it. Doesn't really matter as long as you put it back. It's also a good time to check if you have any manifold leaks. You can see from the old manifold gasket, it's quite badly rusted anyway, but you can see where you can see the black coal, which is basically exhaust gas, where it goes straight out through the side of the gasket. So one half of this had quite a significant exhaust leak, so it will run much happier once we've put a new one on it. This is the old release bearing for the clutch. It's completely roasted. That was making a lot of noise. And in the flywheel as well, there's a little pilot bearing which usually goes bad. You can see it's quite frayed around the seal, and also that is toast. This is the old clutch. That's my new pilot bearing. This is my old clutch. Quite shiny. Not the worst in the world I've ever seen, but not the best either. I think this clutch would have gone for a bit longer, to be honest, if it had not been for the release bearing, which was likely to come apart any second now, and it made a horrific noise at idle. So if you remove the flywheel to get out this pilot bearing, it should come out relatively easily. Yeah, there you go. And it's out. So the idea of bolting up the clutch is you have to make sure that the disc in the middle is centered in the middle of this opening, and then you go around the outside and slowly snug up the bolts just by hand. I just pinch them at first, tighten them up with the ratchet, and you always have to make sure that's, if this isn't straightened up, there's no way it's going to go on the gearbox. It's as simple as that. And now that the new clutch is on the car, and that the new bearing is in the gearbox, we can put these 2 back together at long last. And I always mark these with a little bit of permanent marker, not that you can see it because they're quite dark. Can you see it on there? No. So you can see here that the engine is free floating. I can move it around a little bit. It's still too high to engage the input shaft from the gearbox, and I need to go down very, very slowly, very, very gently, and then try and gingerly push the two together to mate them up. Once I've got that lined up and the gearbox mostly pushed together, then I can worry about starting to locate these little dowels here, and also these studs at the bottom that I mentioned earlier are pretty essential to get lined up. But once the input shaft is lined up, they should go in without too much hassle anyway. You just also need to make sure that you're not pinching your aircon pipe rather. It's pretty tight on this side, and then same on the other side, that you're not pinching anything, any of the power steering. You can see we're well clear of everything. These engines are pretty well designed to be taken apart, and without the radiator in here, we've got a pretty straight shot of where we need to be. So once you have dropped the engine down far enough, you need to try and fish it down there so you can see. So you need to get the gearbox bolt started so that the gearbox mates properly with the engine, as you can see here, nice and tight all the way around. Once it's done that, the next most important job is to go underneath and make sure that the engine mounts seat properly inside the subframe. Okay, so this is the lower engine mount, which needs to go inside that slot there once I lower the engine down. The other side is already in, and the engine wasn't quite lifted perfectly square, so we may have to do a little bit of finessing, and by finessing I mean a little bit of pry barring to get this properly seated. And once you have the engine mounts in, it should look like this on both sides. The next thing that you need to do is put on the air conditioning belt first, and then the auxiliary belt for the alternator and the power steering pump next. And now I believe we are ready for the radiator to go back in. And I've also plugged back in these 202 sensors down here, and I still need to relocate the power steering reservoir. Okay, so the last thing left for me to do now is to bleed the cooling system and fill it up. I've put the air inlet back on. This one here is held down by two 10mm bolts. The air box is held down with two 12mm bolts. One there and one there. And this main box here is held down by two 10mm bolts, and it has three small hoses on it. One there, one hose just there around the side, that big one, this big one, and then another smaller one just here. This starter motor, as you can see, is back on with its ground. The exhaust manifold underneath, which I showed you from above earlier, is all bolted back into place now. All the ancillaries are done, the two covers over the belts are on, lower hoses in, and that is essentially it. There isn't really a great deal to do with these engines or clutches. Quite simple, really. I mean, it took me quite a long time to get it back in because I was faffing around. I didn't really quite have the technique down for mating up the gearbox to the engine, so that took me a while, but I think next time I could probably have the whole thing in, replace the clutch, have the whole thing out, replace the clutch, and get it back in maybe 4 hours. As in 4 hours from jacking it up to driving away. So all in all, this is not a bad job.